Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTANpod. We've had the great opportunity to talk with Dr. Amanda VanDerHeyden and Dr. Robin Codding. Their most recent published article addresses the belief-based instruction we witness in our classrooms and understanding what the evidence actually says as it relates to teaching and learning. Dr. VanDerHeyden and Dr. Codding, thank you so much for joining PaTTANpod again for this conversation. We're so excited to continue talking about that tension that you identified in the article as this belief that conceptual understanding should really precede procedural knowledge. So what does the evidence actually say from research about concepts versus procedures? Where are we at with that debate?
It's a quick and easy answer.
Okay.
They're bidirectional. And all of the policy guidance documents tell us this, and so you have to wonder, why is this so endemic in schools? Why have teachers internalized this message that they must establish this thing called conceptual understanding before they can ever introduce procedural knowledge building tactics related to skill development in math? And I think it really is coming from a place where we all grew up with algorithm-only instruction. We did not know what we were doing. We were taught in very gimmicky little ways about regrouping, for example, which the whole understanding there is place value, but this was obscured by the way we were taught it, which was, you go over to your neighbor and you knock on the door and you borrow a 10, which meant nothing. And by the way, you don't give it back. So to say borrow is just horrifically confusing. And that was sort of this algorithm-only instruction that we mostly grew up with. My generation, I'm in my 40s, grew up with, which rightfully we needed to evolve as a field to do better than that. However, the pendulum just has absolutely swung, and there are lots of teachers who believe that means you cannot provide procedural knowledge building tactics. That is absolutely incorrect and will do harm to students. So the key, and what the research evidence very clearly says, I want to recommend an article written by Riddle Johnson in 2017, which is a review paper. You can get it on her ResearchGate site. And it's just a beautiful summary that demonstrating and summarizing empirical sources showing that when you build conceptual understanding, that benefits procedural knowledge. And when you build procedural knowledge, that benefits conceptual understanding. So it is a bi-directional relationship.
So it looks like, we see this so much in education, right? We go from one side to the other, just that pendulum swings so drastically from this algorithm only to, oh my goodness, we're not going to teach procedural, that procedural knowledge. So we're kind of in this span here. And what I hear you saying is conceptual understanding feeds into procedural knowledge, which feeds into conceptual, and it goes back and forth. Right. And that's really where we're at, and that's where we need folks to understand that it's really working together. Conceptual knowledge and that procedural understanding really goes together.
Yeah, Hung-Si Wu, who is in California, he's at Berkeley, and he has a lot of his writing right on his website that you can read and access for free. He's a wonderful thinker, and he has tackled this question head on with some really thought-provoking articles in American Educator. And, he says, the resistance that some U.S. math teachers have against teaching the algorithm is just sort of perplexing, and it really reveals a misunderstanding, a fundamental misunderstanding about the coherence of mathematics in general. The algorithm is really the most sort of beautiful and simple expression of conceptual understanding. Understanding how and why an algorithm works is what we're after. So we do want to give children experience in using algorithms to solve problems. We want to give them feedback about the correct use of procedures to arrive at a problem solution. But then we also want to help them know and understand how and why it worked.
So when we think about that, this relationship, this bidirectional relationship you speak of about conceptual understanding and procedural knowledge, what are the implications for me as the classroom teacher? What does that mean for what I need to do in my daily practice to ensure I'm doing both adequately and being efficient and effective with that instruction?
Right. Well, it's a misunderstanding, and I run into this all the time because I will run into first and second grade teachers who say, well, no, we're going to work in combining quantities without actually using the addition sign, right? And solving problems in sort of a standard format. And that's a big mistake, because children, if they're learning, working with both at the same time, they're going to begin to identify things that maybe you even didn't explicitly teach. So for example, as they're working with the standard algorithm, they will begin to, some children will begin to sort of naturally identify close quantities, right? And close quantities, that's a way of making difficult math easier. And so it's a wonderful opportunity within a standard algorithm to say, let's find the double inside 5 plus 6, and that might be easier for us to solve. So what is the double that we could use? 5 plus 5 plus 1, right? Or we can go the other way. And so it's a big mistake to say, I'm only going to teach combining quantities without ever introducing the algorithm, because introducing the algorithm will create opportunities for deeper understanding and learning. And ultimately, we do want children to be able to use algorithms to solve problems, because it is more efficient than trial and error or counting manipulatives. We eventually do want them to be able to apply what they understand about place value to solve addition problems, for example.
And Dr. Codding, what could you offer to that in regards to, what implications does this have for me as the classroom teacher, to kind of add on to what Dr. VanDerHeyden was speaking to?
I mean, I think I would give the exact same advice. I think it's important to remember, one of the things that I always hear about is, we had this curriculum that was a mile wide and an inch deep, and then we have this common core standards that have come through, and we're trying to address it. And the gap is in conceptual understanding. And actually, when you read the empirical work, the gap in U.S. education is not just in conceptual understanding. It's actually in conceptual and procedural understanding. The gap is in both places. So for me, it's making sure that teachers understand that this is bidirectional. You have to teach both together. Students are going to understand deeper conceptual understanding from engaging in procedures. They're going to understand procedures from engaging more deeply with conceptual understanding. The gap in U.S. education is in both arenas. And we seem to be one of the few countries in the world that actually has this pitting of conceptual versus procedural understanding.
Right. Wow. Yes. Good point, Robin. And it's unnecessary. I mean, that's the great Lipping Ma study in was it 1999, I believe, that demonstrated exactly what you just said. We're so distracted by all this debate around philosophy that the benefit to the child gets totally lost, right? We should really be committed to doing what works and what will help children have the best proficiency they can have. And we're clearly not doing that in the U.S.
Right.
So addressing to kind of close the gap for both the conceptual understanding and the procedural knowledge. As you had said, there's gaps in both areas, and that's where we really need to kind of rectify that issue. I want to pivot for a minute, and we've talked about this before, this notion of explicit instruction. So I just want to shift there for a minute. What are you seeing, what are you witnessing in the field as a common belief amongst those in the classrooms about explicit instruction?
Yeah, oh my goodness. This is such a I know Robin is passionate about this too, but teachers so misunderstand what explicit instruction really consists of, I think. So I think sometimes when you say direct instruction, or you say, we gave it a PR makeover and we call it explicit instruction now. And so what some teachers hear is that is, or I think they think that you mean that there's this didactic presentation of content, and you model, and then you procedurally have children practice and get feedback, and that's all there is to it. And that is just absolutely not what effective direct instruction and explicit instruction looks like. So I just read a great old paper by Engelman this week that a colleague sent me, and the whole paper is about when you deliver highly controlled instructional design, well-developed curriculum materials, when you use those to first introduce new content to learners, what you're really doing is you're preventing children from making errors early in the learning sequence by the design of your content. So we know that when that means when children are at this acquisition stage of learning, so we're trying to build conceptual understanding, that means we really need direct support of the teacher. The teacher has to be present. The teacher has to be verifying what the student's understanding is. We would say in behavioral language, have they made the correct discrimination? And if that is not occurring with close contact from the teacher, then children are going to learn things incorrectly. They're going to make an incorrect discrimination. It will cost you twice as much instruction later to remove what they have learned incorrectly. So that upfront control of the way instruction is delivered is really important. And what that means is that is me arguing against sort of discovery-based or inquiry-based learning, where children are provided with opportunities and are sort of just left alone to sort of wrestle with it and discover problem solutions. That needs to be, there's a happy medium there, okay? And it's fine for children to explore and consider and try to connect what they're learning. I mean, really, we would call this like a generalization probe.
Right,
exactly. If they don't successfully do it, they need explicit instruction around how to do it. You know, in my own work, I've built lots of math intervention. Robin has too. But for us, Tier 3 math intervention in my world always includes scripted activities to build procedural understanding and scripted activities to build conceptual understanding. And we introduce them in that order for Tier 3 intervention. The reason we do that is having children work in a supported way with procedural problem solving, to me, is a great warm-up activity, because oftentimes with children who are struggling, they have had this very prolonged failure experience in math. And so they are not going to be brave and comfortable about articulating their thinking or making a guess. They might be hesitant. They might feel shy. So when you do the procedural piece first, like a cover, copy, and compare, which I know Robin has used a lot, that sort of warms them up. And now there's a clear answer and they're having some success and they're being supported by the teacher. And then when you move into the conceptual understanding piece of our lessons, which are scripted, now we believe that the child will have more success revealing their thinking, articulating their the patterns that they notice in the work that they are doing, anticipating or making predictions about what a solution might be given a more challenging problem iteration. So I like to introduce them in that order in terms of intervention. But I say to teachers all the time, you can do it in any order that you want because it's bidirectional. So if it really bothers you to do it the way we've laid it out, with the procedural piece first, followed by the conceptual understanding and our daily intervention sessions for kids at risk, flip it. It doesn't matter so long as you do both.
And Dr. Codding, I want to ask you this. We just heard Dr. VanDerHeyden speak to this misconception of explicit instruction in the classrooms and what we're witnessing in the classrooms, and it's kind of going against what the evidence says. You're seeing the same things. How do we rectify that? How do we change those misperceptions about explicit instruction or direct instruction in the classroom for our teachers?
Well, I think it's important to point out that this is one of the most effective educational practices ever discovered. And when we start to think about the number of students that are entering or receiving special education services in math that might not need to be, we start to need to think about how do we put that into our core instructional practice. We also, in our multi-tiered frameworks, right, we are saying that every student has access to grade level instruction. That's every student, regardless of their area of difficulty or disability, needs to be able to have access. And we're not going to have access to grade level core instruction unless we're using explicit instruction. I think one of the other things Amanda had mentioned was this idea of constructing math principles when a child doesn't actually have or possess the concept or the skill yet, as a way to introduce something brand new. That actually is going to deter students from engaging in the task, particularly those that have a history of educational failure. And that's what I often see in classrooms teachers doing first, is this idea that kids will discover what the principle is. And as Amanda mentioned, and what I have said to teachers, I'm like, okay, if you're going to use that strategy, and that's fine, it's great to have kids kind of discover and construct, but let's do it, as Amanda's already said, as an application activity. So we've already introduced the skill, we've already introduced the concept, students understand and have had practice with that, and then we're giving this activity to see if they can find this thing that they already know exists as an application task. So I've sort of asked teachers in schools to reorder and put that in a different place. And then again, that's more aligned with what we know is the instructional hierarchy, how skill development occurs.
So it's that looking at, discovery learning versus explicit instruction. There's a time and a place for both. When we're thinking about new content, new concepts, new procedures, we need that direct explicit instruction as opposed to having kids discover, and who knows what they're going to discover. I mean, let's be honest, who knows what they'll discover? But there's a time and a place for that.
Right. I just had a little Twitter theme on this last week, matter of fact, and lots of teachers were chiming in. And one teacher said, frankly, I don't have all the instructional time in the world to let children just figure it out and discover it. That is not, if nothing else, it's an inefficient way to build learning, right? So there is a question of allocation of instructional time, and you have a certain amount of content that needs to be mastered, understanding that needs to occur, and you just can't get there if you're necessarily, I would make a case you're not going to get there if you're sort of allowing kids to just sort of figure it out and wrestle with it. I think it's a perfect recipe for teaching some children to hate math because they're unlikely to experience natural success. And I would just say to teachers, it's important that you don't just do what you like, right? I think, we're all susceptible to that. I mean, I know I like certain nutrition trends, and it's like a giant placebo effect, I'm sure. I drink this little green smoothie every day, and I think it keeps me well and healthy. And again, it's probably a placebo effect. I like it, so I do it. But in the world of being responsible for the math outcomes of children in your care, you can't just do what you like or what sounds good. And so you have to be willing to make sure that you are delivering a well-balanced instructional program that does include explicit instruction, even if you have heard through the grapevine that maybe it's not good for kids, or it stymies creativity or interferes with problem solving. That is not correct. That is a myth. You have been misinformed, and you don't want to deprive yourself as a teacher of having this tactic in your toolkit, because as Robin said, it has the most robust evidence to support its effects on learning than any other thing we can consider.
And I think this circles back to the whole basis of this article that you all published. What is evidence-based versus what is belief-based? What is my gut telling me versus what is the science actually indicated through empirical findings? And I think that's kind of the entire crux of this piece, was really being more critical, being smarter than what you have in front of you, and being able to ask and being open to ask the question, is this accurate? Is this true? Is this going to give me the outcomes it's saying it's going to give me? So I think that's really the crux of all of it. And so I so appreciate both of you taking, your extended time to talk with us on PaTTANpod. We're so glad that you published the article. We're looking forward to more feedback and more conversations around belief-based versus evidence-based instruction and practices. And at PaTTANpod, we want to continue to inspire others to grow. Thinking about all of our conversations around the tensions that are evident, what we've been talking about, what advice might you offer to the field? If we could just kind of briefly share one key piece of advice for those listening out there, I would greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, I would say avoid the extremes. As a teacher, if you are paying attention to the learning that does or does not result when you use certain tactics in your classroom, you'll make the right decisions. So the most important thing is to evaluate locally what you are trying to do in terms of instruction. And if children are not gaining proficiency in your classroom, to be willing to take a look at what can I shift? What can I do differently? And I think the case that Robin and I are trying to make in our article, that we really believe if you go to the evidence base, you'll find some good tactics there. And if philosophically they seem to be at odds with things you have heard from your professional organizations or in your training program, be open to vetting those ideas yourself. Looking under the hood and avoiding the extremes. So if you've been given the advice, for example, it's dangerous to teach the algorithm, that's extreme advice. That's extreme advice. And you should, question that and think about, is there a way that I can hedge against bringing harm to students because I'm implementing some practice that it really is just about beliefs and philosophies and somebody's good idea, but it's never been tested.
I think that's
or it has been tested and it's shown to be invalid.
Sure.
Yeah.
And Dr. Codding, can you share some advice for those in the field?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have been able to sort of talk about is, that explicit instruction is necessary, that conceptual and procedural knowledge are intertwined, that we need to be using timed activities and practice in order to promote good math outcomes. And I think one of the challenges that we've also talked about is that we know that the curriculum that we are purchasing doesn't have enough opportunities to practice or enough explicit instruction in it. We know that fluency building activities are not necessarily part of the core curriculum. So I think it also is important for curriculum directors, instructional consultants, and teachers to collectively together to supplement what's happening in their math classrooms to make sure that they're engaging in these three really important practices.
I think these are good words of advice to leave by. So thank you so much. You know, PaTTAnpod is lucky to have both of you as friends of ours. So thank you so much, Dr. Codding and Dr. VanDerHeyden, for walking us through these tensions that we identify and the science behind what's actually happening in the field. So we're so appreciative and so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth in your students every day. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTAnpod.